welcome everybody to this final presentation in the seminar series that I've been running since the summer called Neuroscience and in this one here, we are going to be looking at the neuroscience of gender identity. And the inspiration from this really came from what I experienced to be a lot of confusion in people around the differences between sex and gender and sexual orientation. And I think it's really important for anybody who works with other people or who is just a human being living their life on this earth to understand the differences between those and also what kind of fluidity exists within those different categories. So we're going to go on a trip together that will hopefully be mind-opening and heart-opening for you. So I've called this presentation Beyond the Binary, the Mosaic of Humanity. I noticed there was a lot of confusion in people that I speak to and people that I teach in various places around these labels that we assign to other people and ourselves, and there can be discrimination about some of those labels. So my intention as we start is to open up the possibility that we do not have to be dual or polarized about things. For example, we often talk about black or white, and of course there are many shades of grey. What else would we be seeing on a beach if it wasn't a lot of beautiful different shades of grey pebbles? And what about this popular opposition that people tell you it's like night and day? Well, between night and day there is also the glory of dawn and the mystery golden hour of dusk. And what about spiritual and material? Two worlds that we often think are best kept divided, or we don't really know how to join. And then just consider that we live our lives as embodied soul. So there is spirit within the matter, and the matter is what gives the vessel an ability to carry forward that spirit, right? So those are just three examples that I often hear people say, it's like this or like this, and that's a form of duality that I would like to overcome. So the two topics of the presentation today, the main one is the opposition that we often use between male and female. And we're going to be looking at that from a lot of different perspectives. To begin with some physiology, we're going to go into a bit of a talk about chromosomes and the difference between what sex and gender are. We're going to be looking at a case study with somebody who is gender variant and discover that there are many ways to live a very fluid, happy and fulfilled life without necessarily subscribing in quite such a polarized way to one or the other. We're going to be looking at gender in societies where there are non-binary systems, so where they don't follow strict rules about male and female. We're going to be looking at androgyny. It's quite a lot of things we're going to be covering together this evening. We're going to be looking at gender in the brain. So this is where we get into a bit of hardcore neuroscience, the neuroanatomy, the connectivity, and the neural development of gender in the brain. We're going to be looking at changing sex, both from a natural perspective. Sometimes it happens in nature that there are sex changes. We will look at the condition called gender dysphoria and transgenderism. And we will also be going into the psychology of gender. So all that I was talking about until now is more to do with biology and society, how we experience somebody from their biological appearance or how society has set up its rules. But the psychology of gender goes into our inner experience of ourselves in a masculine or feminine way, and what are the traits related to that. And then the last polarity that I hope to overcome a little bit with you, it's just a little thing that I've tagged onto the end of this presentation, just to make very clear the distinction between sex, gender, and sexuality, is this straight or gay dichotomy. So thankfully now in society, there's a lot more open-mindedness around that. And I think most people understand that there are more options than just those two. But we'll be looking at what a lot of people don't realize, which is the difference between physical and emotional attraction. So how somebody might identify in one way with one of those and another way in the other. And just look at a little bit of the rainbow of gender and sexuality combinations that there are out there. And then I'll finish with a very, very brief word on the neuroscience of sexuality. So that's what we've got coming up. I will make sure that we have a break just before halfway through so that we can just do whatever we need to do over a few minutes and then carry on. Hopefully we'll be finished in about 2 hours and 20 minutes or so. And like I said, to those of you who arrived a little bit early, I'm going to be doing a number of different quizzes and tests with you from psychology, neuropsychology, and physiology research. So you might want to have a pen and paper ready. If you also have a photocopy or a scan of your right hand, that's useful, but you can also do that after the presentation to see how you do with that one. And if you don't love mental arithmetic, you might want to have a calculator, but you can also use your smartphone if it has a calculator on it. Or indeed ask somebody else who's around who might really like mental arithmetic. Okay, so let's get started then. Now you know more or less what it is that we're going to be looking at. So we'll begin with the difference between sex and gender to clear that up once and for all, hopefully. So, sex, when it relates to the appearance of a person and not something that you're doing with another person, is something that's defined physiologically. And I'm sure you've heard of chromosomes. Is there anybody who could write in the chat box what the chromosomes are that are typically related to female appearance? What would those chromosomes be? If anybody knows what I'm talking about. Yes, that's right. Several of you already know. So XX is what we typically associate with female appearance. And then what are the chromosomes we associate with a male appearance? I'm testing your basic anatomy and physiology here. Very good, XY. Okay, so far we're all in wonderful agreement on this. So there we go. I've color-coded them for us very helpfully. So I've used this kind of pink color for XX and blue for XY. Now I'm going to explode your first notion about gender coding. So in today's society, we tend to use pink for girls and blue for boys. That's not always been the case. In fact, pink was a man's color in the Victorian age because pink is a diluted version of red. And red was seen as a warrior's color, denoting the spillage of blood on the battlefield. So if you think about medieval coats of arms, there was often a lot of red on those, and that was certainly not to denote feminine qualities, but to kind of give a reference to what would happen if you messed around with this person, spillage of blood. And then in the Victorian times, a gentleman would then not be red because he was more gentle, so pink was considered a suitable man's color. Blue, historically, was a female color, and if you think about religious iconography, the Virgin Mary always wears blue. So that's the theory about where blue comes from in terms of being used for women. And so what happened? Pink was men and blue was women until the sexual revolution in the 1960s, where those colors were claimed by the other sex and reversed. So now when we have this completely overwhelming amount of pink toys for girls and blue things and color coding accordingly, actually, if somebody were to time travel forward to our era now from the Victorian age, they would be incredibly confused about what children are using, what color coding in this day and age. So there we go. But I have used the pink for female and blue for male here so as to not confuse you completely, because this is about to get complex. So as we all agree, XX is what we usually associate with female and XY is male. However, without getting into a whole class on genetics here with you, there are variations of those chromosomes. So sometimes women have only one X, and that's called Turner syndrome. So women who have only one X and therefore are called by this Turner syndrome patient name tend to be shorter than other women, and they also often have this kind of webbing here at the neck, so it looks like their neck muscles attach closer to the top of their neck than on other people. They also sometimes have some social communication problems, a bit of an issue with understanding where other people are coming from in terms of their social intelligence. And sometimes they also have problems with spatial relationships, so finding their way around or maneuvering in space, and problems with maths and calculation. So you could say that there might be some learning difficulties in women who have Turner syndrome, but they can usually do very well if they're given the support from the beginning that they need, and they can catch up also on growth almost to the same extent as the average for women. If they're not given hormonal support, which means more estrogen during their younger years, then they are on average about 20 centimeters shorter. That's 7 inches shorter than other women. But with support, they can develop in a much more regular way. So that missing X doesn't have to be a defining fact for the rest of their lives. Many of them have problems with fertility, and it's only about 1% of women with Turner syndrome who are able to conceive naturally without any assistance of any sort. So it comes in varying degrees, the extent to which somebody is affected by this. And here I'm going to just continue blowing your minds with things. One single person doesn't necessarily have the same sex chromosomes everywhere in their body. So we can have what's called a chromosomal mosaic, where some of our cells have one version of these sex chromosomes and other cells have other versions of them. So you can conceivably have a woman where half of her cells have one X and the other half have two X's. That's something that happens when, in the very early stages of development in the womb, the embryo is still in the division stage, and there can have been a genetic fault issue that arose that affected one of the cells that was dividing, and then any cells that followed the division of that one carried forward the same problem. But there can have been another cell line that developed in the normal way. So it's entirely possible that we are a mix of cells. Now, this is kind of a bit extreme when it's to do with these that are usually associated with our sex, but this can happen for many different cell lines in the body. So there are people out there who, for example, have two different blood types. Depending on what day their blood is taken, they come out with a different blood type because their blood stem cell lines divided at some point in this way with a supposed fault on one of the lines. So it's not everybody who has this. It's really an issue that happens during the embryological development, but it's surprising how many things that can affect in the body. From a forensic point of view, it's totally fascinating because somebody could leave DNA somewhere, and that DNA, when they're tested for it, doesn't correspond to them. So this is something very interesting when you're viewing all sorts of things on TV and they're trying to identify who did something. If that person is a genetic mosaic, and also called a chimera sometimes, then you might not be able to identify them at all. So there we are. We are here this evening to very widely open your minds and blow a lot of stereotypes up. So, so there's a very good question here about could this be a cause for hormonal problems or part of the multiple personality syndrome? I wouldn't relate that to what used to be called multiple personality syndrome, which is now called dissociative identity disorder. That's more to do with connectivity in the brain, usually the result of trauma or faults in the connectivity between networks. It could be the cause of hormonal problems. Endocrine glands are the ones that manufacture hormones in the system. So if there are two or several cell lines that didn't develop in the expected way, you could, for example, have somebody who was producing, and this is actually a real case. There is a lady who allows photos of herself to be published because she's so unusual. She creates melanocytes. So she has a lot of those on one side of her body and not so many on the other. So you can see a line down the center of her body where she's much more brown on one side and much more white on the other. So some cells in the body could be X, some could be XX. And I don't know about anybody out there who has a mixture of XX and XY unless, so this is another strange thing that can happen in nature. Sometimes there are twins in the womb, and there is sometimes a phenomenon where one embryo engulfs the other embryo. So if they were fraternal twins, you could end up in a situation where the male twin, and this isn't about eating the other twin, it's just a cellular phenomenon where one might engulf the other one, and you could then end up with cell lines that are both XX and XY. This is very rare, but it's stuff that's worth knowing, that these things do exist within human nature. Okay, so I'm going to carry on with this little explanation of the different chromosomes. There are also women who have three X's. That's called trisomy X, and these women are in a way a little bit different to the Turner ones in stature, because where Turner syndrome women tend to be very short, trisomy X women tend to be much taller. They also often have problems with quite weak muscles, and there can also be learning difficulties, more to do with, for example, language, whereas the ladies with Turner syndrome, it's more to do with maths, spatial orientation, and things like that. The trisomy X women have more to do with communication problems, but again, with the right support, that can be normalized. So there are so many of these different conditions. So I'm showing these in pink because these people appear female from the outside. Then there's another one. So this is one where there is two X's, but there's also a Y. So this is called Klinefelter syndrome, and these people present as men, but may have some feminization of some of their features. So for example, they may have very small testicles, they may have a bit more breasts than the average man, and they often have fertility problems. So the presence of the extra X has an impact on what would be a more regular male development. Someone said in the chat, it's ironic that super male heroes in action films is known as triple X. Yes, that's very interesting. The ladies with trisomy X can also sometimes have fertility problems, not always. So it's curious that that's also triple X is sometimes associated with sexual activity. So there we are, all of these strange things in society that we're not aware of what we're really calling things, that they might mean something else. So Klinefelters, like I was saying, present as men, and sometimes they don't realize until much later in life, if they want to try and have babies, that they're actually infertile and they need assisted reproduction. Sometimes they need donors. Sometimes they need different sperm extraction techniques in order to have in vitro fertilization. So again, the presence of that extra X chromosome creates this difficulty in the body, and that range, it's a whole range, this scale here of difficulties that can present with. I was reading some case studies while I was preparing this presentation and got really absorbed in some of the stories to do with this, and I found that often for men who are diagnosed with Klinefelters, it's actually very traumatic to realize that they've got double X and are potentially infertile and can really live in denial about that. So I guess something that's really affronted in this sense of masculinity about this double X presentation that will somehow make them less of a man and more of a woman. So, you know, these are sensitive issues. And like I said, some people might not realize until much later in life if and when they're trying to have a family. So we have even more of these to go through. Now this one, Jacob's syndrome, this is X double Y. This is a little bit the stuff of legends. When this was discovered in 1800 and something or other, they thought that XYY created a kind of hypermasculine man. What goes with XYY is often a very tall stature. So these guys are 185 and plus. So they're easily over 6 feet, can be up towards 7 feet if you work in the imperial system. And they started to realize that they found a lot of these men in institutions, in prisons and in foster care and other kinds of institutions, and began to wonder why. And then, unfortunately, a correlation was made that later on has turned out not to be true, which is that men with XYY, so this Jacob syndrome, are somehow more aggressive or more violent than other men because of that double Y. Now, that carried on for decades, this misrepresentation, just because there happens to be more men with this XYY presentation in prison than there are outside of prison, supposedly. But what was actually going on was that having the two Y chromosomes meant that there were more learning difficulties and potentially, not always, but potentially a lowered IQ as well. So if you add up lower IQ potentially and learning difficulties, these would be men who would come out from their schooling with perhaps less options and might be more likely to get into criminal activity, which is often the case in society. Less options and perhaps just looking for a way to make it through somehow perhaps because of the learning difficulties, just doing whatever they can to make a life. So it's actually because of those difficulties that there is a consequence of these guys with XYY ending up in institutions at a higher rate than men who don't have that. Once that misunderstanding was cleared up, there was actually a series of books that became a TV series called The XYY Man. And he was a cat burglar, so he was very tall and skinny, so he was very good at crawling into buildings and stealing stuff. And he was then reformed, realizing the error of his ways, and he became a secret agent, a spy, and a very good one at that. So this is something that was shown, I think, in the 1970s on TV, and it is also a book series about this particular XYY superhero guy who turned out to be a very good secret agent because of the Jacob syndrome that he had. So that's a happy story that this has been cleared up and that wrong association has now been discarded. So there's more of these. So you might think, well, how rare is this? Actually, it's not that rare. 1 in 500 live births has one of these. So let me be very clear about that. 1 in 500 women is likely to have triple X. 1 in 500 men is likely to have XXY Klinefelters. 1 in 500 men is likely to have XYY Jacob syndrome. So if you think about that, even in a small village with just 1,000 people, you're likely to have 2 people walking around who present with some of this, and they may or may not even know. Likely with these here, they wouldn't know. And we're not done. Now we come to the really trippy stuff. You can have people who have XX chromosomes who present as men naturally and genetically without any intervention whatsoever, and that's called Diller-Chappelle syndrome. And this is something that's surprising, perhaps, but if you understand a little bit about the process of masculinization in the womb, it makes sense. So the discovery about XX men came about because they realized that during the process of sperm being produced, there's lots of little cells that are dividing, and there is a little area on the Y chromosome that's called the SRY gene, which is responsible for starting off a whole cascade effect that happens that results in the masculinization and the kickstart of a whole load of processes that change the fetus from female to a male appearance. If that SRY gene is somehow, when that XY chromosome is dividing, if that SRY is somehow pulled onto the X instead of staying on the Y, this is the process of meiosis. When that happens, you may then get somebody with XX who has the SRY gene on the X chromosome. So that's basically XX. So somebody can have those chromosomes and only find out much, much later in their life. They live life as a man and then realize later that in their chromosomes, they are actually considered female because of this SRY gene that has been transposed onto the X when the process of meiosis, cell division, was happening in the creation of sperm. So it's a rarity. This one here, I think, is about 1 in 10 or 20,000. So much more rare. And we have one more to look at, which is XY presenting as female. So this is known as androgen insensitivity syndrome. And there are a number of people out there who live their life as women, but become a kind of superwoman in a way. So women who are XY basically don't have the receptors in their body for androgens, such as testosterone. With androgen insensitivity syndrome, effectively, you get people who are producing a lot of testosterone in their body. They essentially have testicles inside their body, and they're producing lots of testosterone, but the receptors on their cells that normally receive the testosterone and do useful things with it, if you're a man, those receptors are not there or are not receiving the testosterone. So they are essentially women who tend to grow quite tall, and they also don't have body odor, rather wonderful thing for them. And they also tend to have almost exaggerated feminine traits because this is an interesting biological fact. If there's a lot of testosterone in the system, that testosterone goes through a process in the body of being turned into estrogen. And this also happens for example, bodybuilders who are taking too much testosterone. There is what's called an aromatization that makes the testosterone into estrogen. So these women's bodies, because of the amount of testosterone that's flooding them, actually begin to be flooded by estrogen. And so they grow wide hips and large in the breasts, and often end up almost looking like supermodels because of these characteristics that develop. And then much later on, they might realize that, so this is during adolescence, they might realize their periods aren't starting at the same time as the other girls. And that's because they don't have a womb. So they can have normal sex lives, they would have a vagina like other women, but there's no womb. And what on an ultrasound might look like where the ovaries should be are in fact testicles that are kind of in the wrong position. So this is something that medical literature, which is a bit of a patronizing thing to do, decided that it's best not to tell patients when they realize this. So they might do surgery to remove these ovaries that are all twisted and contorted. And then when they take them out, they realize that actually they were testicles instead of ovaries. And that was pretty much done until a couple of decades ago, that people were not informed that that was a condition that they had, because it was thought best not to disturb these women by telling them, actually, you are, from a chromosome point of view, a man. I think these days it's something that the medical establishment has decided it's much better to be open with patients about, instead of this sort of more patronizing attitude of not telling people what's really going on with them. So we're going to be hearing later on in the presentation today some music by a lady who has AIS, androgen insensitivity syndrome, while we're doing one of the exercises. So there we are. Now, I've completely confused you, or maybe not, but just to give you an idea that this XXXY thing is really not the end of the story. There is so much more to it than that. So we go back now to the left side of the page. I was saying that sex is defined physiologically, by physiological features. So we now know chromosomes is definitely not black or white, or pink or blue, as it may be. Another physiological thing that is used for defining sex are gonads, which is the name that is used for ovaries and testicles. So this is also a problem, because you might say, well, women have ovaries and men have testicles. What about people who are born with intersex conditions? They may have both of those. What about people who have surgery that involves removing the ovaries, for example, an oophorectomy for different reasons, or who experience some kind of physical trauma where the gonads are damaged? Do you then say they are less of a woman or less of a man because of that? So I think it's very tenuous to try to define somebody physiologically by the presence or absence of the gonads. Then people also use the hormone status to decide, well, if you have estrogen, most estrogen, then you're a woman. If you have most testosterone, then you're a man. What about people, again, who, for different reasons in their body, produce different levels of those? What about women after the menopause? What about men going through this parallel phenomenon called the andropause, where testosterone starts to decline later in life? What about people who, for whatever reasons, for example, a tumor in the body, start to produce a lot of the one they're not expected to have? That can also happen. What about, again, people with intersex conditions, or these chromosomal conditions we were talking a little bit about before, where they may have certain tissues making one and other tissues making the other one? So again, hormone status on its own, I wouldn't say is sufficient to decide whether somebody can be called male or female from a physiological point of view. We are working here with what is typical and normal, but there are so many cases that have to be taken into account where you can't make such a black and white distinction. And then moving on, we also tend to define men and women physiologically through what's called the primary sex characteristics, which would be the genitals. So what is on the outside of the body that we can see, that we call male or female. And sometimes also the secondary ones, which are the ones that develop during adolescence, breasts, hips, beard, voice dropping, etc. Now, that, of course, is also very dubious for people with intersex conditions, people who have different physiological development, although they clearly define as a certain sex with some of the other ones. There are men who have quite large breasts for different reasons. If you drink a lot of beer, apparently one of the side effects of that is more estrogen in the system. There are men who have what's called male boobs, also known as moobs. That's not technical, that's slang now. There are women who have very low voices for different reasons. There are women who have quite a lot of facial hair, maybe through polycystic ovary syndrome or just naturally because they're from a part of the world where women just tend to have more facial hair, etc., etc. So it's difficult to say anything about somebody purely on the basis of secondary sex characteristics. Maybe the primary ones could be easier, but there are also babies that are born where it's very difficult to tell what is actually going on with their genitals, and then often they're assigned as one gender, and that may or may not be the one that they feel themselves to be later. So I'm going through all of this with you in quite a detailed, laborious way, because I'm trying to open up this idea that this binary system of sex being defined physiologically based on XX, XY, ovaries, testicles, estrogen, testosterone, and what genitals you have and what secondary sex characteristics you have, it is really not as simple as that. So that's what we call sex, which is this identification as male or female. Gender is unrelated to this. Gender is a cultural construct. That's to do with social and psychological factors. So gender is somebody's sense of their identity. So we tend to overlap those two. So somebody in a male body, we tend to think that they are a masculine gender, and somebody in a female body, we tend to say, okay, they're a feminine gender. However, I looked up a couple of days ago how many people are on this earth, and apparently it's about 7,649,000,000 and some. We may have a few more hundreds of thousands now. And in fact, we try to push every single one of those many, many people into two genders. Somebody saying in the chat it's more of a performance. It's not so much about what we do outwardly, it's how we feel inside this gender thing. But often how we feel inside goes with the outward performance. We're going to get into detail about that to make all of this very clear. So you can perhaps see the extraordinary simplification that would be required for all of those 7,649,000,000 and counting to be boxed into one of two gender constructs, male or female. Facebook caught on to this after there was a bit of an outcry about there being gender identifications that were lacking. And last I checked, Facebook was offering 51 different gender options. So having gone from really not catering to people in the gender variant department to catering on such a huge buffet smorgasbord that I read that list and thought, you know, I'm very much into exploring these things, and some of them I wouldn't even know where to begin to try to define. So there's a lot of options out there now. Those of you who are on Facebook might want to go and check it out. There might be something quite colorful that you could define yourself as now that's more appropriate for your experience of your gender. So there we are. So this is now something that started to become more accepted in society, that people may not be in this kind of simplification of male body, masculine gender, female body, feminine gender. So we're going to go into a lot more detail about this. And in order to do that, I would like you to meet Adrian. This is an acquaintance of mine, somebody who I worked with a number of years ago. And I met Adrian when he was a young trans guy. So this is somebody who at that time was born in a female-looking body. So from a biological, physiological perspective, had those characteristics, nothing intersex, and then felt gender-wise that he was masculine. So he was, when I met him, going through the process of confirming his gender as masculine and doing the changes that were needed to his body to align with his own inner sense of gender. And Adrian has very kindly provided me with photos and some narration about his journey that I've got permission to use with all of you. So we're going to explore a little bit about Adrian's journey. So I've called this a non-binary case study, and you'll see why soon. So here are photos of Adrian's development. Adrian was born in a female appearing body, and during his younger years presented female and was briefly in a relationship with a girl. Now, these photos that are on this slide, I'm going to read you out Adrian's own narration of these. So Adrian says, the top far left photo is about a year before he started testosterone. So I'm going to get a pointer out here and just show you. So top left, that's a year before Adrian started testosterone. So at this point, probably regular estrogen levels in Adrian's body at that time, and socializing in what appears to be quite a female, feminine looking way. So this was just before Adrian cut his hair and came out to everybody at work as a trans person. In this next one here along is after, so Adrian says this is after I'd cut my hair, but I hadn't started on testosterone yet, but I had come out to everybody, including work and family. So here we have Adrian, who has now told people that he identifies as a trans person and is going to be on this journey of updating his body to feel more aligned with how he conceives of himself inside. Then he says the next one along is a night he remembers super well. He was super happy because he was going to have top surgery very soon and about to start testosterone 2 weeks later. So Adrian's journey consisted in having a mastectomy, and then that first, and then starting the testosterone later on. So this is a very happy Adrian here who is about to go on the really biological, physiological part of that journey. The bottom left, so down here in this fetching stripy top, is Adrian, who was now on testosterone for a couple of years and had had both the top surgery, so he'd had the mastectomy, so a very male-looking chest, and he had also had phalloplasty surgery, which is the surgical construction of a penis. So at this point, Adrian was very male on the outside and very masculine feeling inside to a certain extent, because there's a twist in the story coming. So Adrian says that it was around this time that he really started getting into performing. And it's also around this time that he started doing work as a drag queen. So a drag queen is essentially a man who dresses up as a woman in a very kind of overstated, slightly scandalous way and performs in that kind of outfit. So Adrian, this trans guy who is now finally aligned his sense of masculinity with a male body, is performing as a drag queen. And he says, I've never actually felt like a woman, but I've always felt somehow feminine, and that needed to be expressed as he was transitioning into this more male body that matched the sense of masculinity inside him. So you're having your minds open now that things are not binary. So then he says the next one along is about the same time when he's got half a drag face on and half no makeup. And so this is this black and white one here. And then we have the next one is when he was performing as Lola with a drag act called the Mr. Sisters, which was him and 2 other drag queens. And this was around the time when he was part of the Drama Queens, which was a lip-syncing drag theatre company. So very interesting. We have a drag queen who is a trans guy who is still on a journey of evolution. So the one here on the far right is Adrian out clubbing. He learned to pole dance specifically because he wanted to make it part of the drag act that he was in. He says he wanted to do something different because his singing voice is horrendous and he's not very funny, according to himself. So that's the story of Adrian up to the point where I met him. And I went to see one of his drag acts one evening with a couple of friends and, had a very entertaining evening. And then we were out of touch for a number of years. And then this happened. So Adrian then realized that these expressions of gender that he had got into didn't really match how he felt himself inside. So I've tried to summarize the journey here that Adrian has been on. He started out in what you might call a homosexual female way, because he had a relationship with a girl as a woman or as a girl in his teens. So somebody observing that would have said, oh, that's a gay female. And then he never identified as a heterosexual female, but he had relationships with men while he was still in a female body. But the men he was having relationships with were predominantly gay, because he didn't want to be considered the straight woman in a relationship. So that's why heterosexual female is in quotes there. That's how it would have looked from the outside, but it's not what was going on in his world or with the person he would be in relationship with. Then he became more of a homosexual transsexual male, because he was seeing men, dating men as a transsexual man. And then these days, Adrian identifies as non-binary. So he says this the construct of male, female, masculine, feminine doesn't have room for me. And furthermore, he also now says, I'm just attracted to whoever is the right person. It's often men, but it's not exclusively so. So here is somebody who has been on a journey that has exploded both the stereotypes around sex and gender and sexuality. So just a few more photos that Adrian sent to me to say I could share with you. Here he is. He's now a model, does very well in life, and models this non-binary identification of his in a very dashing way, as I think you will agree. Some very, very lovely photos that Adrian has shared with us for opening our minds here. So that's Adrian. I'm starting with him as a little bit of a shocker, because he's probably the most gender variant person that I know, and just doesn't find the need to follow the sort of conventions that we might have around that. So we're getting to a point now in a moment where I'm going to be inviting you to do something for yourselves. Just going to show you this slide first, just to recap a little bit about what we're learning here. So in terms of biological gender identity, so that's what's known as sex identity, the components of that are what's called karyotype, which is to do with chromosomes. So the karyotype is set at birth as XXXY or X or triple X or X double Y or whatever it is. And that's set at the chromosomal level. And as I said, that can vary from cell to cell, depending on the cell stem line's development. Then there's also the gonads, so ovaries and testicles that develop further through adolescence. The external genitalia and the internal reproductive organs are part of all of these components. And then we're going to be seeing later, when we get into more of the neuroscience of this, the brain structure that develops through the lifetime. The connectivity pattern of the brain can vary from men to women, which we're going to be seeing, and the distribution of functional areas as well. So if you take into account all of those variables and the fact that they may or may not match one another. So, here we are in the center and going, well, if all of those are not the same as one another, where does one identify? And how can we understand another person's personal experience of that? And this is where our friend, the gender unicorn, comes to the rescue. So this is a really useful tool to use if you work with other people. Some of you may already be aware of this. It doesn't have to be a gender unicorn, of course. You can also make a much more boring version of this scale, but I quite like the gender unicorn in there. It makes it a little bit more friendly. And the way you can use this is to help explore with somebody what their own sense of identity is. So the four components that, well, there's 5 in total, but we'll go through them now one by one. The first one is gender identity. So this, as the unicorn is thinking there, as you can see on the screen, is the little rainbow that comes from their own mind. What is that person's own perception of their gender identity? So it may be that their identity within themselves is male or female or other. For example, Adrian these days considers himself as non-binary, so that's other. Other people may change their gender identity during their life. People, for example, transgendered people may begin thinking that they're one, but actually realize that it's something else going on. And there's people who sometimes change their gender identity and then it goes back again to where it was before. This is, to an extent, fluid during life as we find out that there are more options available to us, and also as our personal history and the levels of hormones and all sorts of things change within us. So then the next one down is gender expression. This is how we choose to present ourselves to the world. So you could say these are the clothes we wear and how we perform our gender. So for example, for Adrian, his gender expression is very feminine. So despite his gender identity having gone from male to other, his gender expression in a way has been more stable, although there was a period where he expressed himself as more masculine in his early days as a trans man. And then at the same time, moonlighting as a drag queen to make sure that the feminine gender expression was in there as well. So the gender expression is how we choose to present to the world, often through clothes or makeup and these other accoutrements that we use to help other people that see us understand how it is we want to be perceived. And those two don't have to be the same. Then there's the sex that's assigned at birth. So this is down here in the unicorn genital area. And that sex could be female, it could be male, it could be other or intersex condition. So that's usually something that's assigned medically during our very first hours of life. That's also in the chromosomes, which is something that currently cannot be changed. So that's something that stays with us through our life. And then we get to something else, which is not sex and gender, but it's about sexual orientation. So this is different. This is why those are there on the unicorn's heart. So we can be physically attracted to men or women, or indeed other genders. So we'll talk more about that later in the presentation. But so, for example, for Adrian, he spent some teenage years with a girl, with a woman, and so was physically attracted to a woman, but then became physically attracted to men, realizing that that was what it was about, and may also easily be attracted to other people who are non-binary or transgender or one of those other 52 Facebook genders that are available. But there are also people out there who don't experience physical attraction, and they may consider themselves asexual to a certain degree. So even though they're not physically attracted to people, they don't want to have sex with them, they may still be emotionally attracted to people. And they can find themselves in long-term relationships, marriages, where they're deeply emotionally attracted and in love with somebody. And that may be with women or men or indeed with other genders. So I created a little overlay here so you could see a snapshot of a certain point of Adrian since we've been speaking about him, just as an example. So these days, his gender identity is a non-binary. So up here in gender identity, that's where the dot is. His gender expression is very feminine. The sex assigned at birth was female. Physically attracted primarily to men, other genders. And I've simply put the dot at 0 for women because from what I know, he's not really in a sexual relationship with women at the moment. Who knows whether that's going to change. And emotionally attracted to the right person, which could be women or men or other genders, but he primarily finds himself in a relationship with men. So this is something that I would invite you to quickly fill out for yourselves. Okay, so I'm going to put the blank one back up, and you can just look at it on the screen and maybe draw some lines. And of course, you'll receive this presentation later on so that you can work with this. But just before we move on, have a go at this so you can ponder for yourself where you stand at this point in your life. And as I said, I will send a version of this as a PDF document to everybody here later on so that you can use those in your life with people if you work as a therapist or healer or in any capacity with others where this might be useful for exploration and education purposes. So we are going to move on now to gender in society, in those places where there are non-binary systems. So this is where the gender unicorn would be very happy to be living. And I'm going to talk to you in some detail about tribal ways in South America and North America. We will start with the Machi, who are considered to be the shamans of the Mapuche people in Chile. So the Mapuche people are a specific ethnic group within Chile, and the Machi are the ones who are considered to be the keepers of that political, cultural, and spiritual power and tradition. And the photo here shows a lady who is part of the Machi group within the Mapuche people. And what they have in this system that the Machi follow is an alternative gender system where homosexuality, polygamy, and gender switching are all accepted. So I'll tell you a little bit more about how that works in their society. Essentially, when Machi is engaging in an activity, they are tuning into the gender that is considered in their culture relevant for that activity and channeling that as they're doing it. So if a Machi is doing political participation, political speeches, or leading something politically, that's considered a masculine practice. So they would tune into their inner masculinity, regardless of whether they are biologically male or female, whatever that means, right? We've exploded that a little bit. And they would channel the part of themselves that they can connect to that is masculine when they're talking politics. If they are communing with spirit, so shamanic practices, that's considered a feminine practice. So regardless of whether they're normally seen as male or female, they would be channeling their inner feminine force in order to carry out those practices, and so forth with other activities. So this is an important thing because it means that it's actually a very equal opportunity society, because it's not a specific sex that's required to do a role. It's the ability to channel that gender in order to complete the requirements of that role. So I find this very fascinating and something that we may already do in our regular lives in Western Europe and in the Western world as such today, where there are certain activities where we probably think, oh, I need to be a little bit, maybe more of my softer qualities or maybe more of my harder qualities for this, and we tend to call those feminine or masculine qualities, which we'll talk about later on. So I love that they make this overt, and it's something that is an integrated part of their society, which makes it non-binary, because this constant crossover depending on the activity is totally accepted and required for some of the practices. Now, of course, that system has been to an extent compromised because of Western culture infiltrating Chile through specifically the Catholic Church coming and having a very strong presence in South America. So there's been this kind of state-sponsored evangelization that has to a degree infiltrated these practices, with most of the Mapuche these days being Catholic. But remember, the Machi are the ones who are holding the spiritual traditions of the Mapuche people. So it has had an effect on the way that they perform gender. And now there's a little bit of a mix of this non-binary gender system going on alongside the more Western way of expressing gender. So they're juggling this now depending on the context, who they're with, and what their intentions are. I just want to briefly tell you about the lady whose photo is on the screen here. This is Francisca Linconao, and she is the current spiritual leader of the Machi in Chile. And she was falsely accused of various crimes by the Chilean government and has since been exonerated completely from those accusations and was taken out of prison after a vast international campaign for her freedom. So I think it's a very powerful photo. Remember, for spiritual practices, one is supposed to channel the feminine force in the Machi, but for political purposes, and she's a very strong political representative of the Machi. In fact, she took on the Chilean government in order to make them stop destroying the Mapuche villages because of the logging industry. So she tried to use the law to protect her people. So I can see in her, as I look at her face, the ability to also channel that masculine political presence very strongly, while she is also the holder of the spiritual tradition of her people. So I find a very powerful photo of a very extraordinary woman who thankfully now has been exonerated from the accusations that were made against her and brought out of prison again. So that's just one example of the way that there are non-binary systems, very fluid and still used now in Chile despite the political situation and the evangelization from the Catholic Church. We're going to move on geographically to North America. And here, we're not going to talk about one Native American tribe in particular, because this is really a mix of different tribes that I'm bringing together for you here. Essentially, there is a belief in Native American culture that some people are born with the spirits of both genders. So Native American societies historically often had 3 to 5 different gender roles. Do you remember the slide that I showed you where in Western society now we're expected to choose between 2? They often had 3 to 5 different ones. And if they had 3, that would typically be female, male, and two-spirit. So two-spirit could present in various ways. Those who had 5 gender roles would have female, male, two-spirit female, two-spirit male, and transgender. So two-spirit female would be somebody who was appearing biologically female, but presented also with masculine characteristics. A two-spirit male would be somebody who presented biologically as male, but who had characteristics and qualities of a female spirit as well. And the picture that I'm showing here on this slide is a Shoshone two-spirit scout. So this is somebody who would be considered physiologically male, with what we've spoken about that would typically involve, but whose other spirit, second spirit in him, was feminine. And he still performed the functions of a scout perfectly well, but chose to dress in a way that was perhaps a little bit more feminine in respect and expression of the feminine spirit that was also in him. Transgender in Native American society would mean somebody who was crossing over from one to the other or didn't find a way of identifying within this two-spirit female or male system. So that's somebody who would be moving between the genders. Now, so how did this come about? How did they live this in their society? So in Native American society, there was not traditionally any form of moral judgment about love or sexuality with regards to how somebody expressed or who they loved or were attracted to. A person wasn't judged for that, whether they were a man who liked women or men, or a woman who liked men or women, or nobody or whatever. Instead, a person would be judged for their contributions to the tribe and for their character in themselves. And true to that, they wouldn't enforce a gender stereotype on children as they were growing up. Instead, they would allow children to have gender-neutral clothing. So I found this old photo here of a Native American child. And it was only when they reached a certain age that they would decide for themselves whether it would be a basket or a bow and arrow that they would choose. And I think this child here has made an excellent choice by having a puppy, useful for people of any background and any gender orientation, I would dare say. So all of this became much more of an issue when Europeans arrived and actually tried to eradicate this openness to gender. And there are historical references to some of those people who came over and were taking notes and pictures of this system, who said we have to eradicate this gender system that they have before it goes into the history books. So people who were two-spirit in these societies were actively hunted down, either reformed or killed and destroyed because of their two-spirit nature, which is a great, great loss, because of course they're a human being and they also held a very special role in Native American society. Two-spirit people were actually highly revered in Native American society for various reasons. An ability to see the world through the eyes of both genders at the same time. A little bit like the Machi in South America, channeling the genders and being open to that expression. Also associated with having a very good intellect, probably because of a life of self-questioning. Where do I fit and how do I wish to express myself? That level of self-reflection can lead to a much more insightful nature instead of just taking things as they are and not having to reflect too much on the nature of anything. Keen artistic skills, and also often seen with an exceptional capacity for compassion, probably because of an ease of being able to relate to anybody without saying these are just my people or just these ones here. And the photo that I've got here for you on this slide is a married couple back from those days. And this is Lakota Squaw Jim. So this was somebody who was two-spirit male, so presenting biologically as male, but also expressing the female spirit within him. And he is the one on the left. So the one on the left is Lakota Squaw Jim, and the one on the right is his wife. And his name in Lakota is Osh Tish, which means finds them and kills them. So no matter how Lakota Squaw Jim chooses to dress, do not mess with Lakota Squaw Jim, because he will find you and kill you. So he gained notoriety from extraordinary heroic actions during certain battles that happened, where he was able to save hostages and destroy the enemies that needed destroying. So you can see it's not about a gender stereotype. He could absolutely dress as Squall-Jin and find himself two-spirited and still be a part of very masculine practices, as it were. So that's just a little snapshot of tribal cultures that have embraced non-binary systems, but it doesn't end there. So this map here is a representation. All the dots show places in the world where there are known non-binary systems that have been in place or that still are in place. And I've given you the reference of the website. It's pbs.org. And if you search on there for gender diverse cultures, or just type in the link as I've given it to you there, you can explore every one of those markers and find information about those cultures, tribes, societies, where there are more than two genders that are used or enforced or encouraged in society. So a very rich and diverse world that we actually live in when we choose to not squeeze ourselves into boxes around genders. So all of that being said, we are going to do another little interactive exercise now, and it's going to take about 4 or 5 minutes. So I invite you to get your pens and paper out. And while we do this, I'm going to play for you in the background a bit of music by Eden Atwood, who is a jazz singer, and she's also an intersex activist. So when I mentioned at the beginning that some people are born XY chromosomes but have androgen insensitivity, Eden Atwood is one of them. She looks absolutely all woman, but her system has a lot of testosterone in it, and she just doesn't have receptors for it. So she is completely out as an XY androgen sensitive woman. So she has a fantastic jazz voice. So I'm going to show you now the questionnaire that I would like you to fill out on your pieces of paper, and we will play some of her music in the background to inspire you. So here we go. This is what's called the BEM sex role inventory. And there is a long version of this and a short version. So I've chosen the short version here for you. And what I would like you to do on your pieces of paper is write each of these numbers down, and you might just write a word next to it. So later on, when you refer to this, you remember what you were doing. So you could write, for example, 1, defend beliefs. And for each of the items on here, I would like you to write a number next to the item from 1 to 7 that says, how often is that true for you? So for example, you'd write 1, defend beliefs. If you never defend your own beliefs, you would write 1. And if you almost always stand up and defend your own beliefs, you would write 7. Okay? So you have from 1 to 7 for every one of the items that are on the screen. And I will give you 5 minutes to do that now with Eden Atwood serenading us in the background. Breathless. You only think you look so wonderful. You're like a breath of spring. You leave me speechless. I'm just like the birds. I'm filled with melody, but at a loss for words. That little grin of yours, that funny chin of yours, does so much to my heart. Oh, give your lips to me, for darling, that would be the final touch to my heart.
You leave me breathless. That's all I can say. I can't say more because you take my breath away. You leave me breathless. That's all I can say. I can't say more because you take my breath away.
So I'll just give you another minute or so to fill out as many of these as you can. So for those of you who have already finished, I'm going to tell you what it is we're going to be doing. I'd just like to make sure that everybody here has at least written down the number of all 30 things. And even if you haven't finished scoring yourself, just make sure you have the whole list written down so you can carry on putting your scores down. So if anyone could just write me in the chat box, if you still need more time to copy the list down, then I will give you a little bit more time before we move on to the next slide. Okay, so we can come back to this in a moment if anybody's still working on it. So I'll show you the next slide and then you'll know what to do with all of this. So the invitation is to now, we're going to be adding it up, but in a very particular way. So I would like you to draw a square next to item 1. Okay, so item 1 was defending your own beliefs. So just draw a square next to that one. And then draw a circle next to item 2, which was being affectionate. Okay, so circle next to that one. And item 3, you draw a triangle next to it. So that was being conscientious, attention to detail. Okay, and then you repeat that pattern until you get to item 30. So item 4 will have a square, item 5 will have a circle, item 6 will have a triangle, and so forth. Keep doing square, circle, triangle pattern until you reach 30. And when you've done that, I would like you to add up your total scores of the squares, the circles, and the triangles. And that's the bit where you may wish to either use a calculator or just love mental arithmetic. So I will just go back to this slide before here in case anybody's still working on that. And you'll know if you got the pattern right if you have item number 30, conventional, with a triangle next to it. And when you're done, if you could just write done or ready or yes or something in the chat box so I can keep tabs on you. Okay, some of you are very fast. I'll just wait for anybody else to also be ready. Adding up, take your time, don't get it wrong. What you want to do, once you've added them up, is divide each of your total scores by 10. And then you might just want to write that on the piece of paper with either a square, circle, or triangle around it, so you know what your total score for each of those shapes is divided by 10. So for example, if your score for all the squares is 53, your final answer in the square would be 5.3, right? And once that's done, we'll get on to the exciting bit that follows. Okay. So a couple of you are done. Is there anybody who wants more time, or shall we carry on? So just write in need time or something, and I will wait a little more. Okay, we'll just wait a little while longer to catch up so that we have as many people with these scores as possible. I'm just going to move on to the next slide because we might save some time when you realize what it is that's going to happen. So we only actually need the scores for the square and the circle, but I couldn't tell you that until now because it may have biased your answers earlier on, okay? So this questionnaire that you've been working on here is in fact a collation of qualities that tend to be assigned to men or women. And there are also other words in there that are not necessarily associated with male or female qualities, but that are considered to be positive or negative personal characteristics in general. So if we just go back to that overview list for a moment, number 1 is defending my own beliefs. That tends to be subscribed to as a masculine quality, and affectionate tends to be a feminine quality, whereas conscientious is neither, but it's considered as a positive personal quality. And again, there's the pattern. Independent is considered more of a male quality, sympathetic feminine quality, and moody is considered a negative personal characteristic, but that's not gender biased. Okay, so that's what you've been doing. And often in psychology tests, there have to be what are called these confounds within questionnaires to make sure that people don't guess completely what every single item should be because they're trying to preempt what their score might be. So what I would like you to do is just notice where your total score from the squares is on this masculinity scale from 0 to 7. If you've ended up with a total masculinity score of more than 7, something must have gone wrong in the adding up, or you haven't divided your final number. Remember, you have to divide the final number by 10. So just notice where you are on that. Make sure that you're very clear on what your square total is, divided by 10. And then the same for the femininity score, your total of the circles divided by 10. And then I would like you to look below here on the screen and notice the classification. So this is the outcome of this BEM sex role inventory. If your masculinity score and femininity score are both at or over 4.9, you qualify as androgynous. We're going to go through in detail what that's about. If your masculinity score and femininity score are both below 4.8, that qualifies as undifferentiated. If your masculinity score is at or above 4.9 and your femininity score is at or below 4.8, you qualify as masculine on this inventory. And likewise, if your femininity score is at or above 4.9 and your masculinity score is below 4.8, you qualify as feminine. You absolutely don't have to, but I would love to know in the chat if anybody's willing to share what their classification is on this scale. And I already tell you, when I applied this to myself, I qualified as androgynous. Okay, so we have somebody else who is androgynous, somebody with a feminine score. Yeah. People just reflecting on whether that feels right to them, what their outcome was. Let's see if there's anybody else who has reflections on this, because I'm going to move you on now to explain more about this androgyny phenomenon and the relationship. So somebody else got androgynous and somebody else had either undifferentiated or dyscalculus. Yes. Okay, so let's see a little bit more now about this androgyny idea. So androgyny doesn't mean that somebody is a confused man or a confused woman, you know, a masculine woman or an effeminate man. That's not what it's about. It's a personality type that is characterized by a balance of masculine and feminine traits, behaviors, and attitudes. So that could, for example, be a man or a woman who is both competitive and aggressive in a work situation, but also caring and sensitive as a parent, or any other mixture of the qualities that we tend to attribute to men and women. Somebody in the chat is saying very caring, but can absolutely also kick your ass. Yes. So I enjoyed looking for a photo of somebody who would characterize this, and I found this particular lady here, and I thought, yep, don't mess with her. So this idea of androgyny really came about in the 1970s and onwards. Before that, there was a view that people were exclusively masculine or feminine. And remember what I was telling you about the Victorian times about color coding of the clothing. So men, you know, this pink color, and women more of a blue color, and before that even more so. But then in the 1970s, this started to really be challenged as a result, I guess, of the sexual revolution. And Dr. Sandra Bem, who gave her name to this Bem sex inventory, developed this hypothesis about androgyny. And she considers that androgyny is both positive and desirable, that we're not categorized or kind of squashed into a box. And there's more about this. So when you do this study on people through their lifetime, or if you do it on people of different age groups, you tend to find that the older people get, the more androgynous they become. And if you think about that, you know, think about very old people who are, for example, in their late 70s, 80s, even their 90s, there tends to be less of a gender role segregation there. And remember, that's the outward appearance, the gender presentation. But also inside, there may be less of an attachment to being a certain way and more of a true character, perhaps, that comes out, or perhaps less of an inhibited character that comes out. And studies show that the more androgynous we are, the more fulfilled we feel in life. And that doesn't mean to say that if you scored highly masculine or highly feminine, that you're not fulfilled in your life. It's just that on average, when people score with high androgyny, that also tends to go with a high life satisfaction. And this applies especially to women, which is perhaps not so surprising in a society that is still biased in a way where women have to be more quiet and perhaps less fulfilled in a certain way, and men are allowed to go out and be competitive and achieve things and do stuff. Perhaps it's not surprising that women who allow that expression of androgyny to come out, that goes with more satisfaction in life. And interestingly, studies also show that women who rate themselves as androgynous also tend to have better overall levels of wellness. So this is health now, and life satisfaction than their peers. So it goes all the way through to the physical body's experience in life when it's not repressed. The photo that I'm showing here on the screen is an androgynous man. And I love this photo because my mind flips backwards and forwards going, are you a woman? Are you a man? Are you a woman? Are you a man? And I go, well, this is somebody who's absolutely expressing themselves in however the way that they want to, in this way that is really very androgynous, but in a very self-empowered way at the same time. So I think this is a very good representative for androgyny, along with the one we saw in the previous photo. And of course, you don't have to appear as a masculine woman or an effeminate man. Like I said before, this is an internal experience. Here are just photos of people who are also absolutely wearing that on the outside. So that's the BEM sex role inventory. Now, somebody said there was either dyscalculous or undifferentiated. That tends to be somebody who would score in an androgynous way, but who might not express those qualities or find in themselves their expression of them quite so strong. Studies show that people who have undifferentiated scores can be less satisfied with their life, but that's not a hard and fast rule. You might score undifferentiated and still be very satisfied with your life. It's just interesting to observe where the correlations tend to be with satisfaction. So that's that part. We are now going to get into some neuroscience. The title of the presentation, so I'm sorry if I misled you into coming here by giving you all of this other information before, but I felt it necessary to cover this ground with you so that we can see how all of this lives within us and in society before we get into what's happening in the brain. So here we go. Actually, one slide before that, I set your expectations a little bit high there. I just want to tell you about something that happens in society. When you ask men and women about who an ideal man or woman is, they have a very surprising answer. So what they did in this particular study is they got college students to fill out that BEM sex role questionnaire that you just did 5 times. And the 5 times they asked them to fill them out was, first of all, who is the ideal man? So they asked them to score all of those based on an ideal man's answer. Then they did the same for an ideal woman. Who do you perceive an ideal woman would be? Then how are most men? Scored it again. How are most women? And how are you? So they did it 5 times over. And they found in the results that both female and male participants in that study rated the ideal woman as androgynous. So they ticked qualities for her that we've just found now, for those of you who also scored androgynous, to be both from the male and female typical characteristics. Women also preferred an androgynous ideal man. So they wanted a man who was also able to be affectionate and caring and And the men preferred a masculine ideal man. So they wanted a man who was fiercely competitive and all of those other things on the list, and not so much of the other things. So this is what I've tried to show here with the little picture on the screen. A woman's ideal is an androgynous woman, so really owning all of those qualities, and an androgynous man owning all of those qualities. And men think that an ideal woman is androgynous, so she has all of those qualities, but they like an ideal man to be very masculine. So that's an interesting little piece of social psychology there. So without further ado, as promised, we're going to get into neuroscience, but we're not going to get away from another little bit of a social mischaracterization that often happens around gender in the brain, which is something along the lines of this. So a female brain has a very large area in yellow dedicated to chocolate. And a corresponding blue area in men's brains is all about sex, of course. And there's a very, very small neuron somewhere inside there. I don't know if you can see it on the screen. But there's a very small neuron within the sex area of men's brains that is about commitment, and a very small particle that's to do with listening. So these are some of the mischaracterizations, of course, that happen with regard to gender. And some of these I can very much relate to. I'm sure there's a power tool lobe somewhere in my brain. I'm sure I don't have the one to do with ball sports because I'm utterly uninterested in any of those. Movies with explosions and babes, yes, I admit to watching those when my wife is not home. Job stuff, lame excuses, getting lost and not admitting to it is a much larger lobe in my brain than they've depicted here, that's for sure. So maybe some of the women here in the audience can relate to some of these. Maternal urges and weddings as a lobe, a fantasy lobe, a bad hair day lobe, a shopping lobe, that might actually be true. Musicals, sitcoms, gossip, mystery, moods, and behaviors. You know, I think that these cartoons were drawn up by a man for the women and by a woman for the men. What do you reckon? There's a little bit of stereotypical stuff going on there. So I'm sure that a woman would never characterize herself as having mystery, moods, and behaviors, because I'm sure that at that time her inner environment is completely clear to her. So we're going to get to proper neuroscience now, I promise. So here we go. What are the actual neuroanatomical differences between male and female brains? So men's physical size is typically larger than women's, and I'm talking about height and stature here. So it's not surprising that a man's brain would therefore also typically be larger than a woman's brain, to the score of about 8 to 13%. Otherwise, the smaller brain would be rattling around inside the man's skull. However, women's brains have deeper sulci between the gyri. So if you were to take a piece of paper and scrunch it up, you would get bigger grooves if you scrunched it up in a smaller space. If you flatten out the gyri of a male and a female brain, they're actually the same size. It's just within the male's skull there is more room, so those grooves are not as deep, and in a woman's brain they're deeper because it's a smaller skull that they're scrunched up inside. So this whole thing about men's brains being bigger than women's is actually not true. They just take up more room. Does that remind you of situations in public transport at all where a man might take up more room as well? Anyway, so there we are. That's one finding that has also then got a very good explanation for it. Now we're going to talk about brain connectivity. So inside the brain, as those of you who've been following a few of these neuroscience seminars with me now may be aware of, there are things called neural networks. So there are neurons inside the brain, and they are connected from place to place within the brain. That's what allows us to do more complex thinking and have automatic actions. Now, when you do something called diffusion tensor imaging studies, they're ones that essentially look at how the white matter inside the brain, so those are the motorways inside the brain, how they're aligned and connected. You can see on those that male and female brains actually have, on average, different connectivity, and that only develops during adolescence. Interesting. So on children, this is not the case. Women, statistically, on average, tend to have better connections from side to side between the two hemispheres. And that means that women tend, on average, to score better on different tasks and tests that are verbal, so to do with language, and that involve memory and intuition, because those are tasks that require information to be passed very efficiently between the two hemispheres. So language is often dominant in the left hemisphere, but on women, language can more often be collateral. So this is often why when a woman has a stroke, for example, in the left hemisphere, in the language area, she may retain language function or get back language function faster than a man, because in men, language is often lateralized more strongly on the left side. It's more rare to find a man where language has two strong centers on either side of the brain. So women are good at things that go between the hemispheres. The researcher who did this characterized women in this way. Women are better at intuitive thinking. Women are better at remembering things, such as birthdays and anniversaries and such like. When you talk, women are more emotionally involved. They will listen more. So thanks to this crosstalk between the hemispheres that's going on. Men, on the other hand, as you can see on the, so these are diagrams, these are obviously not the scans that look like this, but this is an average of the different scans shown in a diagrammatic form. Men have more front to back connections within each hemisphere. And that means that men tend to do better on tasks that involve motor skills and spatial tasks. So that's because if you are having to manipulate something, that will be happening here in your motor cortex. And if you take that back directly to the visual cortex at the back of the brain, if you have faster connectivity there, it'll be faster for you to imagine how you're going to manipulate an object while you're visualizing what the outcome of that might be. So those forwards and backwards connections there do that. We've got somebody asking, is that nature or nurture? There is some argument to say that a lot of this is nature. This is to do with the testosterone and estrogen exposure that happens during adolescence. Okay, if you know teenage girls before, during, and after adolescence, they sort of develop into these little diplomats that are into all of this social stuff that they may not have been into before. And boys start to get much more into spatial sports stuff, computer games and whatnot that involve moving things around. And, you know, it's a little bit of a different set of interests that can develop stereotypically on average, right? But there is also some studies that show that this already begins in childhood, because we tend as a society to give girls girly toys that are like cute and fluffy and whatever, whereas boys get stuff that you have to manipulate, like blocks and bricks and cars that you need to use more motor skills with. So it's actually, I think there is a bit of a nurture thing involved with this, how we set boys and girls up, but the effect of estrogen and testosterone in the brain are different. They do activate and deactivate different areas, to put it in a kind of very generalized way. Studies, for example, have shown that people who are transitioning from female gender to male gender, so testosterone is inserted in the system, develop better spatial skills than they had before. And people who are transitioning from male to female gender develop more of an ability to have social intelligence, so a better ability to empathize and imagine what another person is thinking. And their sense of smell gets way better than it was before. So this idea that women have a better sense of smell, that is really estrogen based somehow. I'm not quite sure of the mechanism. Would the use of birth control influence this? I don't know. I have not seen or remember seeing any studies around that. So that's something we would have to look into separately. So if somebody has a lot of estrogen in their system from the pill, I know anecdotally that that's said to create more of a mood effect, because estrogen is related to experiencing mood more intensely. Testosterone tends to not make mood experience. I mean, you know, this old idea that men tend to be more level. I don't know whether that's always true. Men can always have big ups and downs, but perhaps the intensity with which mood is experienced is estrogen related, and maybe the pill would have an effect on that. But these are things we would need to look into to say anything about. I'm just saying things that I think I remember here. So that's to do with brain connectivity. We're going to move on now into structural brain dimorphism. Dimorphism means, so morphos is to do with shape and di is two. So can we say that if you were just to take a scan of a brain, can you say that that's a male or a female that brain belongs to? So here are some things that are known about this. The hippocampus is a structure that sits in the temporal lobe, so here on the side, and it's related to memory and spatial memory as well, finding our way around places. So that is more active on the left side in females, and it's more dominant on the right side in males within the brain. So the hippocampus is in both hemispheres, and so it has this difference in activation between the two sexes. And that influences cognitive reasoning, because whatever you're activating, whatever side of the brain you're on, is going to activate networks accordingly. And there may have been some of you here on this seminar here who've seen some of the previous seminars where I talked about what are the actual differences between the specializations on the two sides of the brain. So if the hippocampus is very active on the left side in women, that's going to activate other structures than those in men. So women tend to use verbal strategies more than men Remember, language is more lateralized on the left, although more women have more on the right as well. So women are more likely to talk themselves through some sort of task or use words to figure it out, whereas men don't tend to do that as much. They try to just figure it out in a more logical way rather than the talking through or discussing the strategy. And somebody in the chat room who is female says she does that a lot. Yep. I think I do better when I talk myself through problems rather than trying to figure them out. So I can really relate to that strategy. So that means that you can actually see in the brain the hippocampus and its activation is different. Now, aggressive and defiant behavior is associated with a smaller volume in the anterior cingulate cortex in boys. So the cingulate cortex is a structure that runs like a kind of coat hanger from the front to the back around the center of the brain, and it helps with a lot of the regulation between the frontal lobe and the limbic system. So if that is decreased in these boys, you can kind of understand why they might have more aggressive or defiant behavior, because they're not regulating their own behavior in the same way. So the frontal lobe isn't inhibiting those impulses that might come out from the limbic system in the same way than if the anterior cingulate cortex was much more developed. So it literally has more room to send messages saying, no, don't do that. That's probably not a good idea. Last time we did that, remember what happened? Whereas instead, if that's a very small line of communication, the limbic system will carry it away. So those are some of the obvious differences. Another one is in a structure called the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, VMPFC, if you do a lot of neuroscience. This is a really interesting structure in the brain that is quite well known in mindfulness as well. So it's a structure that sits just behind the skull here in the forehead, in the middle, in the crevice between the two hemispheres, so in there. And that is more dominant when the limbic system is activated in men on the right, and on the left is where it's more dominant in women. So the extent to which that applies is quite striking. There are some case studies published about men who have brain damage, and what they found was that if a man had damage just on the left-hand side in that area, in the VMPFC, he would be able to return to a relatively normal work and social life. So he would make a good recovery from damage to that area. Whereas if that same structure was damaged on the other side, on the right-hand side, only there, he would have problems with tasks that were quite normal. For example, how to be in society, how to go out and do his shopping, and he would have problems with impulsivity and making poor judgment and not being able to regulate himself emotionally. And those are all tasks that we really develop when we also develop mindfulness. This ability to see how we're acting and regulate ourselves and then let go of it, not just give in to impulses or follow whatever judgment we come up with. So much more difficult for a man to make a recovery when the right VMPFC is damaged. And again, this is not for all men, but there's a tendency towards that side being more active in men, and in women, the left-hand side. So it appears that there are some differences in the brain between men and women in general. However, you can almost see this coming now because I'm doing this with everything that I'm presenting to you. Those documented gender differences are often taken as a support that there is this sexually dimorphic brain. Dimorphic meaning two different shapes. So one could say there is a female brain and there's a male brain. However, that would only be true if those gender differences in the brain were very dimorphic. So that, for example, in the man, there is a much smaller anterior cingulate cortex area, and in women it was much more like large or something, you know, that there was a real noticeable structural difference, and that there wasn't much overlap between men and women, you know. So for example, in the man it would always be 1 centimeter, but women always have 3 centimeters or more in a particular area. I'm exaggerating, but just so you can see, it would have to be really different in order for that distinction to be true. Secondly, it would also have to be internally consistent. So if you have one male structure, for example, a small anterior cingulate cortex, then you would also always have to have this very strong activation on the right-hand side in your VMPFC area, right? And then other areas we've spoken about, for example, the hippocampus, would also have to follow the male pattern. That's internal consistency. So a male brain would always have to have the same ones, and they would have to be noticeably different to females. That is just not the case. There's so much fantastic research that's being done on this at the moment. A study done by a group in Israel, the lead researcher is called Joel, and she has published this article and is continuing to do follow-ups on this about sex beyond the genitalia. And she calls this the human brain mosaic. And this is really, if you remember nothing else from everything we've been talking about in this presentation, we are now at the crux of the matter. So pay attention. What they did in this study was they collected brain scans, MRI scans specifically, from lots of other studies that had been done on all sorts of things. So they didn't have to put thousands of people through MRI scanners themselves. They collected the data from other study groups. So they were not biased. They just took all of the data. And they had 1,400 or more scans that they looked at. And it's known that there is about 116 areas, regions in the brain where there may be some gender difference. But they decided to only look at the 10 areas where there is the largest gender difference because they wanted some real meaty stuff to work with. So they looked at these 10 areas and they found that between 23 and 53%, so that's a quarter to half of all of these people, depending on which study this information came from, had brains that had both male and female features. Okay, so a quarter to half of all the brains had both male and female features. And so that's people who were really overlapping. Okay, they're right in the middle, both male and female. And they found that the percentage of people who only had female or male regions in those 10 areas was incredibly small. In fact, in some samples, it was 0%, and the maximum was 8% of people who only had exclusively male or exclusively female characteristics in those brain areas. So this idea of there being a male or a female brain in reality is really not realistic. Okay, so we're going to look at this a little bit more. I'm hoping you're beginning to feel a little bit open-minded and liberated at this point. So this is now to do with the development of the brain. And please, I'm very happy to have your comments and your questions in the chat box if there's anything that occurs to you as we're going along. How does the brain develop in terms of masculinity and femininity? It's not that every area in the brain has a little switch in it that goes masculine and feminine. And it's certainly not that there is a switch in the brain that turns on as masculine or feminine as we grow. Not at all. There are two completely separate processes called masculinization and femininization that happen independently in the brain. So this sexual differentiation actually progresses independently in different brain tissues. And that means that there are both genetic and environmental variations in the sexual differentiation of different tissues within the single brain. There may be an area in the brain, and this is quite known from case studies on trauma and PTSD, that begins to differentiate in, for example, a masculinized way. And maybe, that hippocampus begins to develop on that side in a more masculine way. But because of an environmental exposure, which could be due to chemicals or some sort of nuclear exposure or something else, it takes on a different differentiation route later on because they're not one or the other and then they're set. They are independent processes going on. It could be that somebody begins to have a feminine version of, for example, that anterior cingulate cortex, but because of a trauma that happens and there is a flood of testosterone that happens in the brain, then that might take on more of a masculine characteristic afterwards. So you end up with what I've tried to show here with this picture on the screen, which is lots of different areas that all have their totally own and unique and evolving version of masculine or feminine typical expression, which I think is quite liberating, actually, to think that all of those things don't have to go together at all. And those of you who were scoring undifferentiated or androgynous on that pansexual inventory, some of that also relates to the brain. Those of you who scored very high masculine or feminine, You may very well also have areas of your brain that don't conform to that. You know, if you look back over those individual items that you scored, now knowing which ones are typically male or female, you may find that you scored yourself on some of them, and it may very well be that the mosaic of your brain totally agrees with you. So just to underline to you that this mosaic of personality traits, attitudes, interests, and behaviors, some of them are more common in men rather than women, some of them are more common in women rather than men, and some of them are really common in both men and women. And so we're now coming to another little interactive part here. For those of you having to leave, please see the recording later on so you can play along with some of what we're about to do now. Thank you for your participation so far. So we're now going to get to a bit where we're going to play a few games. So for those of you still here, you're in for a little treat. I have collated for you the male brain versus the female brain skill test. Okay, so for those of you who are here, I would like you just to refer to what your BEM sex role result was. So if you scored more feminine, I'm expecting you to do very well on the female brain one. If you scored male, I'm expecting you to do very well on those. And if you scored androgynous, you are welcome to score however you're going to score. Okay, so we're going to start out with some typical male skills now. And a typical male skill that men generally score better than women on is what's called mental rotation. So you are going to see on the screen 4 shapes in a row. And the one on the far left is the reference. And the other 3 may be versions of that same shape, but seen from a different perspective. And I'm just going to tell you now that only one of them is an actual rotation of the one on the left. And your job is to type as quickly into the chat room as possible which one of those 3 on the right is an actual rotation of the one on the left. Okay, I hope that's clear. So I'm going to show you on the next screen those shapes. And we've got 2 rounds of this. So if you don't get it now, you'll be able to do it for the second one. So here we go. Here they come. So number 1 is your reference there on the left, and the ones on the right, A, B, and C, only one of them is a rotation. Okay, so we've got somebody here who's already decided which one it is. Anyone else with an idea about this? Okay, so somebody said A, somebody has said C. Anybody else? I don't know if anybody else is still playing along with us here. Okay, so I will just let you know that the correct answer is in fact A. So that's interesting because I noticed that the person who said A is somebody who scored androgynous, and the one who said C scored high on the feminine scale. So you're actually acting out your inner gender experience very precisely here. I hope that's okay to say for those of you who are participating. Of course, this is all anonymous. No one watching the recording of this knows who you are. Okay, so we're going to do another one of these. You can absolutely blame the feminine brain if you didn't get that one right, or thank your masculine or androgynous brain if you did get that one right. So here comes another one. Ready? Here we go. So have a go at this one. So is it A, B, or C that is the correct rotation of that shape on the left? Okay, so we have 3 completely different answers here. So if somebody said C, somebody said A, somebody has said B. The correct one is in fact B. So we have our person here who scored androgynous, who got it right. Somebody else scored androgynous and said A. And we have somebody who said C, who had a high feminine score. So there goes the typical female versus male brain quality again. So the correct score was B for this one. Okay, now we have an opportunity to make up for this. We're going to have a typical feminine skill now, which is verbal memory. Now, the way this one works is it's a little bit longer, and there's a bit of memorization to do. Okay, so roll out all your skills and tricks for this one. I'm going to give you 30 seconds to memorize some words on a grid that you're going to see on the screen, and you also have to memorize where are they on the grid? So there's going to be a cross on the screen and some words in each quadrant of that cross. And your job in those 30 seconds is to memorize the words and their location. Okay, don't write anything down. Don't take pictures of the screen. You're only cheating yourself. Okay, so here we go. 30 seconds that begin now. Time is flying. 5 more seconds. Okay, your time is up. Here's the first question. Which of the following words was not seen in section 1? Let me have your answers in the chat box, please. Okay, you're welcome to write the word or just put A, B, C, or D to make it easier. It was indeed desk. Well done. You got that right. Next question. What word is missing now in section 2? Ox, fox, locks, or box? A, B, C, or D? Excellent. You have got that right as well. It is indeed fox. Excellent. Question 3. A word is missing from each section. Which one is missing in section 3? Vase, bridge, ink, or computer? You guys are doing very well. It is indeed B, bridge. My gosh, you're doing well. I guess we have a lot of people here who scored feminine or androgynous who are completely rocking this test at this point. Question 4. Which of the following words was not in section 4? Cup, vehicle, ink, or green? Which was not in section 4? Okay, we've got some agreements here that it is indeed a cup. You guys are extremely good at this. Very good. Okay, we're nearly there. 2 more questions. Question 5. Which of the following words came from section 1? Was ink, crown, or holiday in section 1? Okay, some answers here. Ink, bridge, crown, or holiday. And you're all saying it's holiday. Indeed, you're right. I'm blown away by your skill. Last question. Let's see if we can get 6 out of 6 here. Which of the following words was not in section 2? Green, fox, crown, or computer? Which of those was not in section 2? Okay, we've got some very fast answers going on here. Anyone else? A, B, C, or D? Green, fox, crown, computer? Okay, it was A, green. So most of you got that right as well. So well done to those of you who got that correct all the way through. This is obviously where having a feminine or an androgynous brain is really paying dividends. A little bit of a shame that in the audience this evening we don't have more people who scored very high on the masculine scale to see if they would be total failures on this task, but doing very well on the mental rotation. So well done. Very, very impressed with you. So we're going to move on now to another part of the presentation, which is to do with changing sex. So here we've been exploring your skills, your inner skills from the mosaic of your brain and how that's developed through your life, giving you the skills that you now have. And we're now going to look at what happens when the biological sex is changed, either through natural causes or through the person's own volition through a condition called gender dysphoria. So hold on to your hats and glasses. We're going to go into the animal kingdom first, just to see how things are there, to take a little bit of inspiration. So here, we're going to be talking about fish who seem to have a lot of very interesting things going on. So I found that there are actually a lot of species that have something called sequential hermaphroditism. And that means that they essentially change sex during the course of their life as a completely normal inbuilt anatomical process. So clownfish, which is like Nemo in Finding Nemo, wrasses, moray eels, gobies, and other fish species are known to change sex, which includes their reproductive functions. So just imagine if that was in humans, there would be certain times in the year or in your life where you would grow a different pair of whatever you may have. And that's a completely normal, expected part. So in a school of clownfish, again, this is little Nemo from Finding Nemo, it's always built into a hierarchy with a female fish at the top. And when she dies, it's the most dominant male at that point that changes sex and takes her place. So little does Nemo know what's coming for him. If he's the boss of his school of fish, he is going to become Nemet or something like that if he takes the place of the dominant female. And in wrasses, which is from the Lebridae family, sex changes from female to male. So the largest female in a harem changes into a male and takes over the harem when the previous dominant male disappears. And I've actually seen, this is on the Blue Planet series that recently came out with David Attenborough, and they show the process of this with a particular type of fish as well, different to the wrasses. And she disappears into a hole in the coral reef or whatever, and comes out some days later totally changed. And the pictures I've got here on the screen shows a female, the brown one with the blue stripe, and the male appearance afterwards. This isn't dramatic. That looks just a little bit like a color and perhaps a slight size change. But for other species of fish, it's totally dramatic. They look completely different afterwards. So that happens as a completely normal part of life. And then I found this absolutely wonderful thing, Caribbean hamlets. They are simultaneous hermaphrodites, everybody. So that means that every individual that is a Caribbean hamlet is both male and female hermaphrodites at the same time. So of course that's a problem if you're trying to have baby, because you might fertilize yourself, which means that there would be less genetic variability in the offspring, which is the problem. So what they do is they trade roles. They do something called egg trading while they are fertilizing one another. And the way this works is they meet in a familiar spot on the reef. And then as the water column is rising, two of these hamlets will rise in the water column, where the one who at that time is acting as the male embraces the one acting as the female while releasing sperm, while the one acting as the female releases eggs. So the sperm and eggs are kind of mixed together in this rising water column. Then, after a few seconds, they go back down to the reef. A few minutes later, after recovering from the experience, they rise in the water column again, but this time the roles are reversed. So the one who released sperm before now releases eggs, and vice versa. So this is apparently something that's so common that you can see it at sunset in many reefs in the Caribbean, where this spawning behavior is going on. So that's quite a fabulous thing that these fish have got going on there. Who's feeling like being the man first, and who's feeling like being the woman first at any given night, and then of course the opportunity of reversing that afterwards. So very wonderful, the animal kingdom. So we're going to bring that back to the human domain now, where of course there are conditions that happen in human beings that are intersex, and that can be something that happens from birth, that there is an intersex appearance, or something that happens as the person is maturing. Now, I'm not a geneticist and I'm not an endocrinologist, so I can't tell you about the fine detail of this, but I can just tell you that what happens most often if there is a natural sex change through a human being's life is usually that at birth there is a female appearance and the male appearance comes later, usually at puberty, because there is a lack of a particular enzyme. And I've just written two of those there on the screen. You can look those up. This is rare, but it is something that happens. So from my understanding of it, during the fetal maturation and during childhood, there isn't enough testosterone at that point because of some enzyme problem in order for the male characteristics, the genitalia, to develop. And it takes for puberty to kick in for the levels of testosterone to really start doing something that would differentiate that person into more of an obvious male. And that can come with different problems. For example, hypospadias, which means that there's a hole further down the penis than where it's supposed to be at the tip, etc., etc. It does happen. So somebody can look female and then become male as testosterone sets in later on. Also, people who are genetically female, so with two X chromosomes, although we now have a very open mind about that, they can have something called congenital adrenal hyperplasia. And that means that there's a problem with the adrenal gland. And so they're not able to, for the adrenal gland to make the hormones cortisol and aldosterone. And what happens if those two hormones are not floating around the body is that the body produces more androgens because they come from the same place. So there's a kind of feedback loop that happens. The body is feeling I'm lacking cortisol and aldosterone. I better send signals to the place that makes those, but it just so happens that as a side effect, that place also makes testosterone, including in women, totally normal functioning XX women. There is also testosterone, just at a much smaller level. So because of this feedback loop that happens, there's more and more testosterone made. And these girls can start, the photo I'm showing here on the screen is a girl who has this congenital adrenal hyperplasia, and they can start developing sexual characteristics that are more masculine. So for example, the clitoris can start to grow and look a little bit more like a micro penis, for example. So that's relatively common, and it's something that needs intervention with blockers and estrogen to help balance. There are apparently a few cases of children that appear male that turn female, but the etiology, which means the kind of underlying mechanisms in the body, isn't understood about that. So I can't give you any more information about that, except that it's been reported out there. So that's natural sex change, something that's happening because of the body's functioning, not because of the person wanting for that to happen necessarily. We're going to move on now to gender dysphoria and sex change. This is somewhere a person who has gender dysphoria, which is a physical condition. It used to be qualified as a mental illness. But now, in recent years, it's more of a physical condition, or solely a physical condition, actually, where the person feels that their sense of gender, remember that's an internal experience, doesn't match their external physiological appearance. And the picture I've got here for you is from a photo series made by a Cuban photographer called Claudia Gonzalez. And she photographed a group of people who were going through a sex change procedure. So here on the right is this person before the sex change, and on the left, there she is, having gone through these different things she wanted to do to align her inner experience with her body. And she goes by the name Ashana. So sex change is usually applied to what's called gender reassignment therapy, but because we now know the difference between sex and gender, it should more correctly be called a sex reassignment therapy, because sex is the physiological appearance, remember? So sometimes that involves surgery, so reconstructing or removing various bits and pieces. It can also be used to describe the medical procedures for intersex people once they've decided how they want to appear. It used to be that intersex children, it would be decided by the doctors, and that would often be to lop off anything masculine because it wasn't fully developed. So they would generally qualify intersex babies as girls. And then later on, there could be gender dysphoria because, in fact, the person would feel themselves to be more masculine or indeed non-binary. So decisions were made for them that later on caused a lot of problems. Thankfully, now there's more open-mindedness around that, and intersex children are hopefully more often allowed to make decisions about that for themselves. The term sex change can also be used more broadly as somebody who's living as a woman instead of living as a man, trying it out, and they may or may not have any medical or hormonal intervention at all. So that's gender dysphoria and sex change in a nutshell. Now, what about the brain anatomy of people who are transgender? Well, it's much more common out there for there to be male to female transgender people. I think it's on the scale of 1 to 4. So there are 4 more transgender women out there than transgender men. That also means that in terms of research, there is much more research on male to female transgender brains than the other way around, simply because there haven't been as many who've been dissected after death, I guess. Or indeed had MRI scans done simply because of the numbers. So what's been found, and this is very, very interesting, there is a central part of the bed nucleus of the stria terminalis. Now, I'll show you where that is on the screen. I don't know if you can see the cursor, but this here is the bed nucleus of the stria terminalis, this aspect here, this bit of gray inside the blue. And that is a part of a complex limbic forebrain, and it has a role in controlling autonomic, neuroendocrine behavioral responses and also sex-mediated behaviors. This area is larger in males in general And the size of it is not affected by hormonal changes in adulthood. So that means that if somebody experiences themselves as female and they take testosterone, that part of the brain doesn't grow. So this is something that is bigger in what's called cisgendered men, CIS. That means men who were born biologically as men and continue to be men. Now, people who were assigned male at birth, but who actually feel themselves to be female, who may or may not take hormones, etc., that area is significantly smaller in them than in cis males. And it's actually a similar size to in cis females. So that area of the brain seems to be more related to somebody's gender identity than the physical expression of gender. Very interesting. And there's a similar finding in what's called the uncinate nucleus of the hypothalamus. On this brain, that would be in this area here, just below the blue area where this fold is, next to the red area. That's also different in size between men and women. And again, in male to female trans subjects, that area resembled more cis female size than that of cis male subjects. So although these people would appear biologically male, that area in their brain was more similar to females. So it seems that those areas that were previously thought to reflect the genetically determined sex of the individual actually are more associated with the gender identity. So when people say, oh, this person is just pretending to be trans, or, that it's something that people have made up, actually, there is a physiological underlying process in some areas of the brain. And this may not be the case with every single trans person out there, and I wouldn't use it, on a kind of diagnostic level, but at least it's something that can be said to be different, that explains why there can be such an acute experience of gender dysphoria. I'll start by explaining the photo here. This is from a photo series by an Australian photographer called Emma Leslie. She approached families where the children were experiencing gender dysphoria and asked the children, how would you want to be seen? And she allowed the children to choose their own outfits and the location for the photo shoot. And she took pictures of them in the way that they would want to be seen. So this little person here was said to be male at birth, but this is how she wants to be seen, as a mermaid by the ocean. Okay? Wonderful. So remember what I said at the very beginning of the presentation. We're coming full circle now. Sex in humans is usually defined by those 4 factors that we spoke about: chromosomes, gonads, which means ovaries and testicles, hormonal status, and primary, sometimes secondary sex characteristics. People who are going through gender confirmation, as it's also sometimes called, or gender reassignment therapy, chromosomes can't be changed yet. You would need a really extensive genetic intervention to do that, and who knows what the outcome of that would be if that were even possible. Gonads can be removed, but not yet replaced. We can't 3D print testicles or fully functioning ovaries yet, with all of that involved, way beyond where we currently are. The hormone status, though, can be changed. So you give somebody estrogen, progesterone, androgen blockers in the case of somebody who wants to transition to match their female identity, or you can give somebody testosterone to match a male identity. Primary sex characteristics, i.e. genitals and breasts, can be changed through to a more or less functional extent, variable, to the point where it's almost impossible to see or experience a difference. Quite successful for female to male as well, although it's more complicated. I met a surgeon who once said it's easier to dig a hole than to build a pole. And he knew what he was talking about. So still surgery that's evolving to meet the requirements of gender reassignment in some aspects. And of course, there may need to be laser hair removal for people who don't want a beard anymore. And there may be other things that need to be changed, removed, added, depending on what makes the person happy. There are people who go through gender reassignment and don't do any surgery at all, who are very happy just with the hormonal changes. And like I said before, there are people who are happy just to be identified in the way that they want and don't necessarily need to do anything. Here, just to tell you very, very briefly about this transition process, it usually begins with counseling or a period of having to live full-time in the gender that one wants to be perceived as outside. That's usually 6 months at least, and that's usually done by the medical establishment to rule out anybody who just has an idealization of what it must be like to be a man or what it must be like to be a woman. And actually having to live like that for 6 months to 2 years can be a very eye-opening process. So that's usually done as a kind of preventative to rule out people who may just have another mental illness that's, for example, to do with depression or anxiety, or perhaps has a borderline or bipolar presentation that makes some confusion around the gender identity. And like I said, gender dysphoria is not a mental illness, it is a physical condition. So when that period has been completed, there is usually some sort of hormone replacement therapy if the person wants to do that. And I already spoke about it a little bit on the previous slide. Usually people wait for a couple of years before having the sex reassignment surgery, but some people can't wait. So some people decide to do it sooner than that, and that's why some people become medical tourists. Thailand is a quite hot destination for trans women to go to have their lower surgery done, and it's sometimes less expensive. It's sometimes also less regulated, which can mean that it's perhaps somehow a bit less safe. But there are sometimes also more experienced surgeons in other countries simply because of the volume of surgeries that they've done. So that's just something for people to bear in mind. Of course, there can be a real sort of pressing need to be identified on the outside as one feels inside, and having to wait 2 years for that might seem ridiculous and actually impossible for certain people. Interestingly, I read that sex reassignment surgery is actually one of the most successful surgeries in terms of patient satisfaction. So 98% of patients are happier with their lives after the surgery. That's more than any other surgery on the planet. People who go through sex reassignment surgery are also often seem to recover faster from the surgery simply because there is such a joy at finally being able to be perceived on the outside in a way that matches the inside. And the picture that I've got here for you on this slide is a singer-songwriter from Canada called Jamie Wilson, and he's chosen to share very openly and publicly about his transition. He was from a very Christian family in Canada and didn't really dare to express himself, so looked very feminine, I guess, but inside always knew that he was a male. And it took him a lot of courage, and lost a lot of family and friends during his transition, but decided, you know what, I have to live the life that I want to live. And here he is, looking fantastic as a man, continuing his career very successfully as a singer-songwriter. So wonderful, very nice to have positive stories around this, because it's something that often attracts a bit of scandal and negative stories in the news, I guess. So we're coming towards the end of the presentation now. We just have 2 sections left to talk about. The psychology of gender, we've touched into that a little bit before, but we're going to go a little bit more into traits now. And then we have the little section on sexuality as well at the end. So here we go, I hope you're still hanging in there. In psychology, people are generally sort of qualified by 5 big traits, if you like. So they are openness to experience, conscientiousness, the attention to detail, extroversion, agreeableness, how nice and likely you are to go along with something, and neuroticism. So those 5 traits can be used to make an inventory of the personality. When I asked you to do the demisexual inventory earlier, that was different. That's specifically to get a sense of masculinity, femininity, and androgyny. But this is more about personality generally. So this is used for personality profiling in businesses and all sorts of places to get a sense of who the person is. Now, a huge study was done. 23,000 people were involved in this in 26 different cultures, including Hong Kong, USA, India, Russia. So this was really spanning the world. And when they analyzed the results of getting people to rate themselves on those 5 scales, they found that women tend to rate themselves as warmer, as friendlier, and also more anxious and sensitive to their feelings than the men did. The men, on the other hand, tended to rate themselves as more assertive and more open to new ideas. If you broke it down into all the subscales as well, women tended to score higher on this one called agreeableness and neuroticism, and on a specific facet of openness to experience. So this is too much to go into now, but I put the link here on the slide for you. You can fill out this questionnaire for yourself at the link I've given you there on the screen. It's called the IPIP. It's free to take online, and it gives you a complete breakdown of all the different personality facets. Men, on the other hand, scored higher on one facet of extroversion, and they scored highly on a different facet of openness to experience than the women did. Interesting. So men and women scoring differently on some of these big traits, but similarly on some of them, and it's only on the subscales that you would be able to tell a difference, if indeed you could tell a difference at all, which leads us to this idea of masculine and feminine traits. So there was a psychologist called Janet Space who did a lot of research into this, who said that the same for feminine traits. Just because you have one feminine trait, for example, you might be very caring, doesn't mean that you have another one, for example, loving children. And the same with male traits. Just because you are very assertive doesn't mean that you're also dominating. So the example here is being gentle doesn't mean that you're also very dependent on people. So she found that when you look at people on average, the traits don't go together. And this is the same as what we saw with the brains, right? So gender trait differences do not add up in a consistent way that makes two different kinds of human beings, not at all. So these gender trait differences create mosaics. And I really want you to take that away with you from this presentation. Mosaics of traits, attitudes, interests, and behaviors. Some that might be more common in men and some that might be more common in women. And a lot of this is also about what is society inviting us to be. The picture on this slide is one of many called Rosie the Riveter. During the Second World War, women were needed to do a lot of roles that men had monopolized until then, and they did extremely well at them. So here is one lady who is doing metalworking because the men were out killing one another in the war. And these photos were taken to encourage women to step up and take on some of those tasks. And there's loads of these photos. So it's really a cultural phenomenon where women were called forth. And of course, after the war, when the men came back, it was very difficult for the women to be asked to step out of those roles again that they had completed extremely well, and for the men to sort of tolerate that here were women who were doing all of this stuff that had been the male monopoly before. So a lot of this is also to do with what is society inviting and allowing. You know, the idea now of Saudi Arabia having allowed women to now drive cars come to mind. You know, this still exists out there and changes are still being made. So in terms of these psychological gender traits, they also looked at young people in a different study. 5,500 youths were questioned about their traits, and there are many of them that are a little bit different between men and women, but this study really was only interested in the really big differences. And they found that the personal attribute that allows you to predict whether somebody is a man or a woman just by looking at their scores is whether that person is more or less concerned about their weight. So if a person is more than average concerned about their weight, that gives you an 80% chance that that's a woman, okay? And for sex stereotyped activities, the largest difference was in the use of cosmetics. So if somebody uses cosmetics, there is a 90% chance of being correct if you guess that that is a woman. Okay, but you know what I'm like with blowing up stereotypes? Between 55 and 70% of people had a mosaic of gender characteristics, and it was less than 1% who only had masculine or feminine characteristics. Less than 1% only had female personal attributes in sex stereotyped activities for men and women, right? And here we go. I've put together a little slide just to show you. You know, there's this thing that says you have a 90% chance of being correct if you guess that somebody is a man or a woman based on whether they use makeup. Have that argument with these three here. So here we have Johnny Depp, who uses guy liner. We have Russell Brand, who's a very well-known comedian and social activist in England. He uses guy liner, the one on the right. And bottom left, we have the horse warlord out of Game of Thrones, and I would not have an argument with him about his use of guy liner. So there we are. So just to show you, even that 90%, of course, if they use makeup, they must be a woman. Yeah, right. There's plenty of women out there that don't use makeup, and there are men who absolutely do and rock that look. So good for all of you out there who are not part of that 90%. And of course, if you do that, we totally accept you as well. So we're really coming towards the very last bits now. So I ask you this question: do we have a male or a female nature? And at this point, when you have access to this amount of knowledge and insight into this, the notion of a female or male nature makes as little sense as that of a female or male brain. Because which of those many mosaics of female and male display should we consider to be the actual female or male one? Would it be some profile of pure femininity out of the Stepford Wives that barely exists in reality for the women, or some kind of hyper-masculine male James Bond type character that barely exists in reality? Could it be time to let go of binary thinking and celebrate the fact that there are many different ways to be male, to be female, and to be a human being in life in this world? So I have got one more fun little thing for you, and I'm glad there's a lot of enthusiasm now in the chat room here about that possibility. Can we take the approach that the Machi and the Native Americans had, where we allow people to live their gender? Can we let go of all this stuff and have a lot of less problems, a lot less prejudices, and a lot less inhibitions about who we are? There is a way of measuring whether you had more estrogen or testosterone exposure in the womb, a time at which the brain was being masculinized and feminized already, and of course that carried on during the lifetime. So if you have photocopies of your hand, that's the easiest way to do this. You need to take a photocopy of your right hand. You can also try to do it without, but it's more tricky. I'll just show you the slide so you can get a hang of this and try it for yourself later on. Studies have shown that the length of the ring finger in relation to the index finger tell you how much testosterone or estrogen you were exposed to as a fetus. So this is interesting to take into account now that you did the gender unicorn to begin with. You've done your sexual inventory. You can also do the IPIP questionnaire that we spoke about a little bit earlier, and do this one as well. So you begin to get a sense of your mosaic. So measure from the lowest line on your index finger, as is shown on the screen. There is one ring at the bottom of that finger, and measure all the way to the tip. And then measure your ring finger. There are two lines usually on people at the bottom of the ring finger. You want to measure from the lowest one to the tip of the ring finger and compare those two measurements. If your ring finger is longer than your index finger, you had more testosterone exposure. If you have a longer index finger than ring finger, you had more estrogen exposure. If they're the same length, good for you. And we have somebody in the chat room who's saying the ring finger is much longer, but also experiences herself with a very feminine brain. A wonderful mosaic. Good for you. This stuff here about the fingers is fascinating. There are configurations that correlate with both benefits and challenges in areas such as ability in sports, cardiovascular health, social communication, job choices, etc. If you find this interesting, and I did when I first heard about this, I was like, oh my God, that is so fascinating. There are correlations with kids with autism. That's also to do with a very long ring finger. So the more autistic someone is, the longer the finger tends to be. Women who go into engineering, longer ring fingers, very interesting. Men who find themselves in communication jobs tend to have longer index fingers. There is a book about this that I highly recommend. It's called The Finger Ratio by a scientist called John Manning. When he published this, he had such a backlash against him from society. People were not comfortable with this, that he had to remove a lot of his contact details from the public domain. But the book is available. Have a look at it. Look up the stuff he publishes online. It is very, very interesting. He hypothesized that the reason why nature would make such a thing is that we would need, back in the day, a way of telling if somebody has a lot of testosterone in order to choose them as a good mate if we're female. And so it's a little bit like, he calls it the peacock finger on men. So the longer it is, the more testosterone running in the system from fetus onwards. So that might be something that a woman looking for a very testosterone high man might want as a sexual partner, but it might also something she's on the lookout for to not have if she's looking for a life partner, because remember, women tend to prefer more androgynous men as an ideal man. But it's also known that women respond in a different sexual way to men where there's a lot of testosterone. So, including the pupil dilation is different and all sorts of other things. This is a fascinating area, but way beyond what we can cover now. So those of you who are interested, who are women who look at the hands of men, there you might have your primitive reason why that is. So we have now the very last bit, and this is only going to be a couple of minutes now on sexuality. I just wanted to add this to make a couple of points very clear. Number one, sexuality is not to do with gender. It is to do with physical and emotional attraction. So there are different types of physical and emotional attraction. Somebody can, for example, be heterosexual. That means that they're attracted to the other sex if you are in a binary gender system, right? Because it all depends on your position, depending on then what your sexuality would be decided from there. And if somebody is homosexual, that means that they would be attracted to the same sex as they are, the gender that they would put themselves forward as well, right? So remember the story of Adrian that we heard. He never considered himself a heterosexual female, although at that point he was biologically in a female body. He was dating gay men, and they were interested in him as that as well. So homosexual is also to do with the gender, not just the biological physical sex. Bisexual is if somebody's attracted to both sexes if you're in a binary gender system. And I specify that because I'll just skip the transensual for now and come back to it. Pansexual is if somebody is attracted to people regardless of biological sex, gender, or gender identity. So they're sort of exploding that binary gender system and open to possibilities that are in between and around and everything else. Somebody who's transensual is somebody who is attracted to transgendered or transsexual people. And somebody who's asexual would be somebody who doesn't have specific sexual feelings or desires, but remember the gender unicorn, they can still have an emotional attraction and live a very happy life in a couple, even though they don't express that in a physical sexual way. And usually asexuality comes on a scale. So it may be that somebody never ever is physically sexually active, and it may be that it's once in a blue moon. And there's whole societies and a lot of awareness that's being raised around asexuality now. So there are many possible combinations of gender and sexuality. And again, this comes back to the very reason why I wanted to give this seminar, because people get very confused about this. Gender is personal. So somebody can consider themselves male, female, they can consider themselves lots of colorful tones in between. Remember Facebook, 52 gender options, right? And physical and romantic attraction is interpersonal. It's to do with another or anothers. There could be several. So I've just given you a few examples here on the slide. So the gender could be a man who feels himself to be masculine, or a woman who feels herself to be feminine, or a woman who feels herself to be masculine or androgynous or whatever else, etc. Examples of gender and sexuality combinations, you could have a woman who feels herself quite masculine and very happy with that, and a man who's quite androgynous and very happy with his femininity. They could be a fantastic couple. You might have two biological women together where one is transsexual or considers herself androgynous, and a woman who is extremely feminine both in gender and in her sex identity. You might get three people who are together in a relationship where the very masculine man, an androgynous man, and a very androgynous woman. And you might have somebody who's asexual, who is not interacting with another person sexually, and their gender could be anything. Okay, so those are all different combinations. So just because somebody is effeminate and they're male doesn't make them gay. If somebody's very masculine acting and they're woman doesn't make them homosexual or whatever. You know, there are many options under the sun. And remember, all of this is also very fluid through the lifetime as the mosaic of our brain keeps evolving. So the gender unicorn tells you physical and emotional attraction is different to gender identity and expression. If in doubt, confer the gender unicorn diagram that I will send to all of you afterwards. And then coming to the end of the presentation now, I said I would say a very brief word on the neuroscience of sexuality. And what I want to say about that is there is research that shows that there may be brain differences, but that research is very dangerous in some countries because there are cultures where homosexuality is against the law or even punishable by death. And if that research were widely published and used in those countries, that could be very dangerous for people who are already part of a minority that might be ostracized. So I want to acknowledge the bravery and the persistence in being themselves of people across the world who live in places where their expression of themselves and the person that they're allowed to love doesn't align with what that society is imposing on them. So I want to acknowledge that courage and say, absolutely, rainbow pride throughout the world. And finally, I have a very exclusive scan to show you of a brain of somebody who is in love. Here you are. So I'm going to leave you on the final note from Adrian, who we met at the beginning of the presentation, who has a tattoo on his back that says, "To thine own self be true." And so I want to thank you for being with me in this presentation here today, whoever you are and whomever you love. Good for you. Live your life with an open mind and an open heart. And wonderful that you've chosen to be here. Please spread this information widely so that more hearts and minds can be opened to all of this. And I will pass your thanks on to Adrian for his presence in this presentation here. So that's the end of this whole series of seminars. And thank you for all of your participation, for playing along with all the things that I've given to you as part of this. And if you're curious about some of the other things that were part of this and you weren't there for them, the whole seminar series is going to be online. The first 3 already are. You can download them if you don't already have them. So it's on my website at healingishere.com. You're very welcome to go there and have a look at these. Tell people about it. I think people need to know about neuroscience. It gives us so many more options about understanding ourselves and one another and live more peaceful lives. So if there are questions you have for me about this, or if you want to use the presentations once you've downloaded them from my website, you're very welcome. Share them widely. For me, this really isn't a money-making venture. It's because I want to share themes that matter to me, that I'm passionate about. And you can absolutely share them, screen them, do whatever you want with them. Set them free and let them help people to live happy lives out there.